This morning, as I said, we want to definitely talk about mothers because it is Mother's Day, and I think it's great that we have a day that we've set aside to honor the women who have played that role in our lives. And but you know, Mother's Day is sometimes hard for some women, and it can be tough on people who either have had bad experiences with their mothers, or have lost mothers, or struggle to be mothers. And so one of the things that I wanted to do this morning in the presentation is to do something. I'm thinking, how do we honor mothers, but at the same time also help all women feel honored. And I got thinking about how the Bible treats women in general. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to talk in an honoring way about God's design for women in our lives, and to also look at where that worth is found. And this to me is one of the things that's hardest for us to get. You know, it's been said that men are cerebral and women are emotional. And sometimes that's kind of an oversimplification of things, because some of the greatest minds in history have been women. So how can we say that, well, all men are cerebral and all women are just emotional? And I think it was Ravi Zacharias I heard one time say that he believed that it was that women could connect the cerebral with the emotional. And guys have a hard time doing that. Guys separate their mind from their heart, and they hide away, their emotions and their feelings, and they just go with what they think. And so I thought that was a really good way of putting it, because it's about how there is a complementary strength in our relationships and in God's very design of men and women. And, we could do a whole sermon on how men find their worthiness. Like, where do they seek it? How do they find it? But this morning I want to talk about the worthiness of a woman and where it comes from, and the value that God has placed in that design, in that complementary design, and how it makes, for example, a mother what she is. This morning I said I can't fathom it. My wife did things as my children were growing up I could never see myself doing. And, because I'm just like, knock it off, get up. Wipe yourself off. It's not a big deal. It's just a scratch. Go on. That's how guys look at things. And mom's holding them and taking care and nurturing. And these are things that God put in there. I mean, God made that possible. And the subtitle that I put up here is Far Above Rubies, which you can probably ascertain where that comes from. We will read part of that passage, but I'm not going to belabor it because everyone's beat that passage to death. But I want to talk about some of the things in that passage that maybe we didn't focus in on before. But first, let's look at how the world values women. What is it that the world does? What is our media and all society teaching young women where to find their worth? Is it in their looks? Is it in their physical beauty? Shapes of their body? How much they weigh? What their measurements are? That's why you go shopping and the sizes don't make any sense in the women's department. I mean, I don't get it. It's like a size 5. What's that mean? How many inches is that? Well, I ain't telling you that. Whereas a guy goes and shops and it's like, I think, a 34-inch waist. So that tells us that there is something there that the way society has built around how a woman measures her worth. And back in the 16th century, 17th century, the ideal woman physically is a lot different than the ideal woman today. it just keeps on changing, right? And it's whatever's popular, whatever is showing up on the magazines, whatever is showing up on TV, and these sort of things. And a woman starts to feel like, well, if I don't look like this, then I'm not worth as much. And I think God has a completely different view of you than that. We also may put, especially in the modern day society, not necessarily in biblical times, but in today's society, that value might be found in your education, in the job that you hold, what kind of position you have. I know that the women that I have worked with in business have to work a lot harder than the guys do, because they have to try and make everyone know they're an okay manager, or they're an okay. It's like there's this striving for worth in that. Sometimes a woman may see her worth in whether or not she's married or not. I mean, it's like, is this the goal? Is this what makes me worth something? I've got to find a husband. I've got to get married. And it's not just women that do this, guys do this as well. But the point that what we're going to get to is that your worth isn't found in somebody else. Your worth isn't found in how you're viewed by the world based on your marital status. We come up with horrible words like old maid, and things like this. And what does that convey to young women? Well, I don't want to be an old maid. And to a 16-year-old girl, an old maid maybe 30 years old. And so it's all relative. There's just, how are we currently measuring this? Maybe we measure it in terms of whether or not we have children or not. And then if we get to those points where you can't have children, and then it becomes an issue. I don't feel fulfilled. I don't feel like I'm reaching my potential as a human, or I'm not finding my worth because I don't have children. And so what I want to do is I want to look at how the Bible examines some of these issues about the worthiness that you have in yourself, and where that comes from and where you find it. And I think we'll find that it doesn't lie in any of these bullet points. It doesn't lie in those things at all. But it's really hard for us to think outside of that box. So I'm primarily going to look at one story this morning. I'm going to look at the story of Leah and Rachel. Now, many of you may know this story. Parts of it are very popularized. We don't always tell the whole story. We just, focus in on these little parts that make us feel good. And so, but I'm going to broaden that a little bit and look at this story of Leah and Rachel. So this comes from Jacob, who travels to see some of his distant relatives, a guy by the name of Laban, and he meets Laban's daughter, Rachel, and falls head over heels for this girl. Like, she's beautiful, she's everything from a world's perspective that gives her worth, right? And he's got the hots for this girl. And so he's like, okay, I want to marry this girl. But the culture at that time was, she had sisters, right? Or she had others ahead of her in line. And of course, the dad is always handing out these girls based on their age and how much money the guy is willing to give as the bride price. And but Jacob tries to cut a deal with this relative of his, this Laban, to try and get Rachel, because he really, really likes this girl. So first off, let's look at the situation here. Rachel does have a sister named Leah. And how they're introduced here in Genesis 29, verse 16 through 17, it says, "Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older one was named Leah, and the younger one Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender." Okay, that's kind of a compliment, I guess. But look what it says about Rachel. "But Rachel had a lovely figure and beautiful appearance." So it doesn't say Leah was ugly, but it says here that Rachel was more attractive. And Jacob found the worth in that, right? It was the physical thing that attracted him to Rachel. However, there's this sister whose eyes are tender, and I've often kind of thought about what does that really mean, and I think that is somewhat of a reflection of her heart, because you've heard the saying, "The eyes are the window to the soul." I take this to mean she was a kind person, and she looked tenderly upon people around her. But as the story goes, Jacob falls in love with Rachel. And it says here in chapter 29, verse 18 to 20, since Jacob had fallen in love with Rachel, he said, "I'll serve you 7 years in exchange for your younger daughter, Rachel." And Laban replied, "I'd rather give her to you than another man. Stay with me." So Jacob worked for 7 years to acquire Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because his love for her was so great. Okay, first off, what he's doing here is he can't afford the bride price. And so he's worked out a deal. Okay, I'll work with you for 7 years to pay the bride price, but I want your younger daughter. I want Rachel. And so he agrees to do this. And then we have this romantic statement, but they seemed like only a few days to him because his love for her was so great. And oftentimes this is where we close the storybook. And we're like, see how great Jacob's love for Rachel was. This is so romantic, and etc., etc. But the story doesn't end here when this 7 years is up. In fact, there's a trick that gets pulled on him. And I'm still yet to figure out exactly how this works, even in a culture like them. But Jacob realized that he had been fooled on his wedding night. He ended up being married to Leah instead. And this made him upset, obviously. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit. But anyway, what happens is Laban tricks him and marries him to Leah instead and says, "You don't understand our culture. I have to marry off my oldest one first." And really, I think it was a way for Laban to get more work out of Jacob, is what I think it really was. But anyway, Jacob ends up marrying Leah. Now, he's not happy about this. I want you to stop and put yourself in Leah's position for a minute. Here you are. You're just trying to find your worth the same way everybody else is, right? I got to get a husband. I got to get a husband. And then you see the situation happen with your younger sister and this bride price thing happening with Dad. And all of a sudden, Dad comes to you and says, "You know what? I'm going to give you to him instead." Can you imagine how she would have felt? It would have been like, "Oh, yes, I'm getting the deal here. I'm the one who's going to get this deal." But then in the morning, when Jacob realizes that it was the wrong woman, he's upset and he's mad. Can you imagine what this would have felt like to Leah? What a letdown that would have been. And so Jacob tells Laban, "What do you do? What are you doing? I agreed to work this time for Rachel." And he says, "Well, okay, you work 7 more years, and I will give Rachel to you as well." And of course, this is a time whenever multiple wives was not necessarily frowned upon, apparently. And so it says here in Genesis 29, verse 30, after the next 7 years had gone by, it said Jacob had marital relations with Rachel as well. He loved Rachel more than Leah, so he worked for Laban for 7 more years. So Laban gets a great deal out of this. He ends up getting 21 years out of this guy. So after he's married to both of these ladies, he hangs around another 7 years and works there as well. But I think what I want to focus on is the conflict that's going to occur here between Rachel and Leah and where they're finding their worth. At first, it's finding worth in this man's love. Like that's what they're striving for, and they're in competition one with another. And it says that Jacob obviously loves the younger Rachel more than Leah. So in verse 31 to 32 it says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, He enabled her to become pregnant, and while Rachel remained childless. So Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, now listen to this, "The Lord has looked with pity on my oppressed condition. Surely my husband will love me now." Where is Leah looking for her worth? In the love of that man. And she feels like she's incomplete until that love occurs. And the Lord had blessed her with a child. But instead of being focused on the blessing of the child and all the other things that God can give you in this life, she's still focused on this man. And she's like, good, I got a child. This will make my husband love me now. The next verse tells us she became pregnant again and had another son. And she said, because the Lord heard that I was unloved. Okay, so apparently it didn't work, her idea of being loved by him. It says, because the Lord heard that I was unloved, He gave me this one too. So she named his name Simeon. So she is saying she's unloved. She's finding her worth in this guy. Verse 34, she became pregnant again and had another son. And she said, now this time my husband will show me affection, because I have given birth to 3 sons for him. And this is why he was named Levi. So she's not in the moment, is she? Think about the blessings that are coming upon her right now in her household. The blessing of being a mom and having these children. But she's not seeing the worth in that relationship because she's too focused on getting this affection from her husband. And obviously, he's probably spending more time in Rachel's tent than he is in her tent. And she's having to see this day in and day out, this unrequited love, this thing that is hurting her heart. But she's not seeing the fact that God's been blessing her. But in verse 35, it says she became pregnant again and had another son. She said, this time I will praise the Lord. And that is why she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. It's like a light bulb went on for Leah. She's been putting all her worth into whether or not this man loved her. But now she's getting the idea. God loves me. And that is where my worth is. I will praise Him. He's given me all these blessings. He's given me these children. Now obviously at this point, she's not... it says that she stopped having children. That's a temporary thing. She does have some more later. But the concept here I think is just really cool. It's like God got to the point where she realized that she was being blessed and she was being loved. She wasn't unloved as she thought she was. She was just being loved by someone greater than Jacob. And there's value in that. And once she got it, once it hit her, she didn't need to have any more babies. That was like yes, even though she does have some, it says she stopped at that point. Like that was all she needed at the time. Now the next chapter gets crazy because she's not having any more children, but she still gets in this competition with Rachel. And here's why. The next chapter, first verse, let's look at Rachel for just a minute. Now Rachel has everything, right? She's got the love of this guy. Isn't that where you find your worth? But she's barren. She can't have any children. So is she content with the fact that she's got the love of this man? No. She's still not content. Because she, from her perspective, is unloved in a way. Because she's unable to have children. And listen to what she says. When Rachel saw that she could not give Jacob children, she became jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Now that sounds pretty harsh. She has put all of her worth, into her ability to have kids. So Leah's starting to get it. She's starting to get where her worth is coming from. But Rachel is still not. And so what happens in the course of this next chapter is Rachel comes up with an idea. Well, if I can't have kids, I'll get my handmaiden and marry her to my husband and have kids in my stead, and then I'll have kids and we'll all be good. But it wasn't satisfying. It wasn't good enough. And the minute that happened, Leah's like, well, hey, I can do that too. And so she goes and gets her handmaid and gives her handmaid to Jacob. Jacob's getting the big, the big end of that stick or whatever. It's like, wow. He's got all these women just like falling all over him. But the thing that I find interesting about Jacob is that he doesn't quite get it either. Later on in the story, he ends up wrestling God. And I think that is his turning point. But right now, it's all superficial. And so he's giving these women all these children, but Rachel's still been unable to give a child to Jacob. She finally does have a child, and oddly enough, she has 2 children, and I find her statement here ironic. Give me children or I'll die. She died in childbirth with her second son, Benjamin. She named Benjamin something different, by the way. She named him Ben-Oni, which means the son of my suffering. She died unhappy. She died unfulfilled. And how many times have we read the story of Jacob and Rachel and talked about it like it's some fairy tale, like they lived happily ever after because he worked 7 years and to him it was as a day. We need to drop the romantic notions and look at the value that God is putting in these women in their position. Their value isn't lying in whether or not they have a man. Their value is not lying in whether or not they have children. Their value is lying in what they mean to God and how God loves them and how God can bless them in their situation. Rachel had the opportunity to be happy. She was loved by this man. Leah had the opportunity to be happy. She was bearing children and having the love of a mother and all of this. But it's actually kind of a sad story for Rachel because she finally ends up dying in childbirth. Jacob renames that son Benjamin because he didn't want it to be this negative connotation of him just being the child of suffering. So, what about this Proverbs 31 woman that we talked about before? The most popular part of it here, the very first verse of it, is verse 10. Who can find a wife of noble character? For her value is far more than rubies. Now, the next few verses go on to tell us how good of a worker she is, how much she loves her family, how she's a good seamstress, how she's a good merchant, how she makes the husband proud, and he goes out into the gate, and everybody's like, hey, you got a nice wife, and it's just all this stuff. And the next few verses is talking about how people respond when they see this virtuous woman. And we've often made it about, this is how you become a virtuous woman, right? We've treated those things like they're checklist items to do. And if you'll do all these things, you will be a virtuous woman. But that's taking your worth out of where it lies. Your worth is not in the fact that you're a good merchant or a good seamstress or all these things that it lists there. Because notice what it says. It doesn't say who can become a virtuous woman. It doesn't say who can make a virtuous woman. It says who can find one. In other words, you're already virtuous to begin with, and he needs to find that. So let that sink in for a minute. The virtue that you have that makes you worthwhile is actually given to us at the end of this passage, where it says charm is deceitful and beauty is fleeting. What does the society do? They put all that worth in those things, right? Charm, beauty, but those things are deceitful and fleeting. But a woman, listen to that, who fears the Lord, reverences the Lord, loves the Lord, a woman who is in God, a woman who is in Jesus, the fears the Lord will be praised. That's where virtue lies, is in your relationship with God. And you know, that's what makes all these things so beautiful. Like when we look at like we were just talking about, that comparison between a mother's love to a child and God's love to us. We emulate what we love, right? God put that inside of a woman because that's the kind of love He has for her too. So, a virtuous woman is not made by a bunch of checklist items of what you must do, who you must marry, and how many kids you must have. But your worth is found in your fear or your love of the Lord. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7. Now 1 Peter, everyone wants to read the verses before this, right? And so just one second, I want to address this issue. Is the Bible sexist? You know, people say that. Is the Bible like slanted toward guys? And is it inequitable or anything like that? And the point that I think we're going to see is that it is not. We're looking at things from a worldview that has made certain aspects of a woman's life, or where God has given women strength, we've placed weakness there where we shouldn't have. You know, I watch my wife work with my children. That's the most important job that has ever happened in my household, was the raising of my children. It wasn't some program I was writing at work or some software design I was a part of. Those things, most of those things I was ever working on are gone. They're history. No one will ever see them again. But my children are still a reflection of my wife's work. That's the most important work that ever happened. How in the world does society look at that as a weaker thing or a lesser thing? It needs to be lifted up. It needs to be praised. It needs to be honored. When it says the weaker vessel here in 1 Peter, he's not talking about your position in life. He's talking about women being just daintier than guys, and that they might need physical protection. But listen to what it says. It says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. That is a statement of equality. They are heirs with you. The Bible is not inequitable when it comes to men and women. This whole idea about being the weaker vessel, it's about how the world looks at you and how you physically are, that men should be standing up and protecting what's important. And so I also think it's really cool that God uses the things that are seemingly weak for the most important things that He does. I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. When all these rabbis and all these religious people in the world were available for Jesus to go to, who did He go to? He went to the fishermen. He went to those guys out there that the society had cast aside. He went to the weaker ones because then God's strength is shown. And He does that with women. If we look in the New Testament and look at Jesus' view of women and how Jesus treated women, we start to see that worth. We start to see Jesus Himself doing this type of thing. Jesus viewed them as trustworthy. How might we say that? Well, as we talked a few weeks ago, the whole gospel hangs on an event that happened that we call the resurrection. Who did God choose to reveal the resurrection to? to women. It was the women at the tomb who were charged with sending the message to the guys. You go tell those guys that I am risen. Why did he not just show up to John and Peter to begin with? Because they would probably be like Thomas, right? So what was Thomas? He was like, I ain't going to believe this. This is unreal. I can't believe this. But what were the women doing? They were coming to the grave to serve anyway. They were already in that nurturing place where God wants all of us to be, but those women had what He needed, and they were trustworthy of the message, and it empowered them to do this. I want to look at how Jesus looked at the faith of these women and praised women for their faith. Think about the Syrophoenician woman. Now this woman was she was a Greek. She was not part of the children of Israel, and she's following Jesus around. Now what are the guys doing? The guys are all going, tell that woman to leave us alone. She's wagging her tongue, and we just want her gone. Tell her she's not a Jew. Tell her to go home. And Jesus turns to her and makes that statement about how He's called to the children of Israel, and that His message wasn't meant for dogs. Now you might stop and think, Jesus called that woman a dog. But I don't think He did that for her sake. He did it for the guys. Because He was wanting to teach them a lesson. So what did she say? Well, don't the puppies eat the scraps that fall? Wisdom and faith in that. And I can just see Jesus' face light up and grab a hold of this woman and say, woman, I have not seen faith like this. What do you think the guys were thinking at that point? Wow. Shock and appall. But He's using the so-called weaker ones to show His love and to exemplify that that woman had faith, whereas all you guys have been following me all along. And what's the most popular thing I've said to you? Oh, you of little faith. How long do I have to put up with this? How many times did He say those types of things to His own disciples? Yet He turns to this woman and says, your faith is great. Or the woman with the issue of blood, who was walking through the crowds of people, and she said to herself, if I can just touch the hem of His garment, I will be healed. And He felt the power come out of Him when she did that. Faith. He praises them for it. He uses them for it. To be evangelical. They rely on Him for that. That goes back to the garden tomb thing again, right? Go tell the disciples, I am risen. Go give the message. Be evangelical. I can trust you in this. And the woman at the well. Remember the woman at the well? Samaritan. A woman you shouldn't, and probably an outcast among her own people because she was there alone in the middle of the day while all the other women had already gotten their water. So what was she doing here at the well in the middle of the day? She was the type of person you would avoid, but does Jesus avoid her? No. He sees her worth. And whenever she says, I don't have a husband, He says, you're right. You've had 5, and the one you're with now is not your husband. He's not condemning her, is He? He's letting her know that she's loved anyway. And you know what happened to that woman? She became the first evangelist to the Samaritan people. Not all the disciples who were sitting with Jesus at the time. He sent this woman on to do that. And finally, He knew that the women were dedicated. He knew that, when Dad goes to work, Mom's there, right? Whenever things get hard, it seems like the woman's there. The child gets sick. She's by that child's bed, holding their hands, wiping the sweat off their brow, putting the thermostat in, giving them the medicine, right? They're dedicated. They're more dedicated than we are in many, many ways. Look at when Jesus was hanging on the cross. You know who was at the foot of the cross? Not the disciples. Yes, there was one. We read of John being there. But nobody else except for the women. The women followed him all the way to the cross. And so, as we think about Mother's Day and we think about where we find our worth, think about where Jesus finds your worth as a woman. And guys, think about where Jesus finds worth in the women in your life. And you better be giving them that honor as well. And standing up to be that as well. One of the last things Jesus did while he was hanging upon the cross was he looked down at his mother. John 19, verse 26 to 27. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. The only person directly addressed from the cross was not only a woman, but it was a mother. It was Jesus' mom. And one of the last things he did before he left the earth was to make sure she was taken care of. She looked at the only guy who showed up and said, "From now on, this is your mom, and you need to take care of her." And it says that from that time on, she went to stay with John, and he took care of her. So this morning, as we leave this place and we go back to our homes and we go back to our lives, let's make sure that we know where our value lies. And guys, let's make sure we know where God puts the value of the women in our lives. And on this Mother's Day, let's honor our mother with the same passion and love that Jesus honored his own mother as he was hanging on the cross and gave her the honor and the glory of being loved and being taken care of.